It was after midnight when David Miller sat alone in his dim apartment, the air heavy with silence as he reviewed files scattered across the coffee table. Suddenly, his phone buzzed, vibrating against the wood with unnatural intensity. A voicemail played, a trembling voice whispering, "They know where you are," before dissolving into static. David froze, his breath shallow, and whispered, "Who's doing this?" He leaned toward the phone, but it clicked dead. A piercing scream erupted from outside, slicing through the night, making his heart pound in his chest. He rushed to the window, pulling the curtains aside, but the street below was deserted. The streetlight flickered, shadows shifting unnaturally, as though something unseen lurked in the darkness. David muttered, that scream was real. He hurried downstairs, shoes pounding against the stairwell, and stepped into the cold night. The wind carried faint echoes, but no figure appeared in sight. Then his eyes caught something on the pavement, a small object glinting under the flickering light. Kneeling down, he picked up a metallic charm etched with strange, unreadable symbols. "I," David whispered, "this doesn't belong here." The weight of unseen eyes pressed on him, and the world felt colder, as if the night itself had drawn closer. David stood frozen on the cracked pavement, gripping the charm as the night grew unnervingly still. The silence pressed into his ears, broken only by the faint rattle of a distant gate. He whispered, "This wasn't here before." His chest tightened as he slipped the object into his pocket, scanning every shadow with cautious eyes. The street seemed alive, shapes bending where they should not. He turned quickly, convinced someone stood just behind him, but the space was empty. His pulse raced as headlights flashed in the distance, only to vanish before reaching him. The quiet deepened, and he felt watched, hunted by something unseen. David muttered, "I need to get back inside." He stepped toward the building entrance, the charm's weight pressing against his side like a curse. Inside his apartment once more, David locked the door twice and leaned against it, exhaling slowly. He whispered, "Something followed me." His eyes darted to the window, curtains still swaying though no draft stirred. He placed the metallic charm onto the table, its strange symbols seeming to pulse faintly in the low light. His breath caught as the phone lit up again, displaying unknown caller. David froze, staring at the screen until it went dark without ringing. He muttered, "They're toying with me." A faint creak echoed from the hallway outside his door, and he clenched his fists, straining to listen. Silence returned, heavy and absolute. David sat on the edge of his couch, staring at the charm on the table, feeling the room shrink around him. He whispered, "What are you?" His voice trembled, as if afraid the object might answer. He touched the edge, recoiling as though burned. The lights flickered once, casting the room into sudden darkness, before humming back to life. He scanned the shadows with wide eyes, his chest rising and falling in sharp bursts. His phone buzzed again, vibrating against the table, but this time with no display, the screen completely black. David whispered, "This is impossible." The sound ceased abruptly, leaving the air colder than before. David forced himself to breathe deeply, pressing his palms against his knees. The room felt suffocating, each sound amplified, until silence was unbearable. He rose and stepped to the window, pulling back the curtain. The street below appeared empty, yet the shadows stretched unnaturally far. He muttered, "You're still out there." His reflection stared back faintly in the glass, eyes weary, as though someone else looked through him. A faint tap echoed behind him, and he spun to see the charm trembling slightly on the table, as though it had been moved by unseen hands. He whispered, "It's watching me." David Miller paced the length of his apartment, the metallic charm resting on the table like a curse he could not shake. His nerves frayed with every tick of the clock, each sound exaggerated by silence. He muttered, "This thing is not ordinary." A sudden knock on the door made his heart pound. He whispered, "Who visits at this hour?" The knock came again, louder, demanding, and his hand trembled as he reached for the handle. When the door opened, the hallway stood empty, except for an envelope on the floor. David picked it up, his breath short, and tore it open. Inside was a single slip of paper bearing only the words, "You are being watched." He dropped it instantly, whispering, "They know I found the charm." The air in the hall turned colder, pressing against him like unseen eyes. David Miller locked the door and pressed his back against it, clutching the paper. His eyes scanned the words again, but his hands trembled so badly the letters blurred. He whispered, "Who writes this?" He dropped the slip onto the table beside the metallic charm. The two objects seemed connected, as though meant to unnerve him further. The phone rang sharply, shattering the silence, and he answered with shaking hands. A male voice he did not recognize said, "Leave it where you found it, David, or you won't make it through the night." Before he could reply, the call cut off with static. He whispered, "How do they know my name?" Fear dug into his chest, deeper than before. Determined not to collapse under fear, David Miller grabbed his coat and stormed out of the apartment. His feet carried him through empty streets toward the local library, one of the few places still open overnight. The charm weighed heavy in his pocket as though it resisted his movement. He whispered, "Answers must be somewhere." The librarian, Laura Hayes, glanced up as he entered, surprised by his frantic presence. "Laura Hayes," said David, "it's nearly morning. What brings you here like this?" He laid the charm onto her desk, whispering, "I need to know what these symbols mean." Her eyes narrowed as she studied it, her lips tightening. Laura Hayes said, "I've seen something like this before, but it should not exist here." Laura Hayes ran her fingers gently across the surface of the metallic charm, the symbols catching the desk lamp's glow. She whispered, "This design is older than most people realize." David Miller leaned closer, whispering, "Older? From where?" Laura Hayes frowned and shook her head. Laura Hayes said, "I can't say for certain, but the last time I saw this symbol, it was in a case study about unsolved disappearances." David recoiled, whispering, "Disappearances?" She nodded slowly, her eyes heavy with worry. Laura Hayes said, "If this is real, you're in danger." David's hands clenched tightly against the desk, the words searing his mind. David Miller sat back, the weight of Laura Hayes's words crushing him. He whispered, "Someone left it for me. Why me?" Laura Hayes pressed her lips tightly, whispering, "Sometimes objects like this choose their owner." He shook his head, muttering, "I didn't choose any of this." A faint sound drifted through the library, like footsteps echoing between shelves. Both turned toward the dark aisles, listening intently. Laura Hayes whispered, "No one else is here." David rose slowly, whispering, "Then who's moving back there?" The shadows between shelves seemed deeper, pulling the air into silence. The sound of footsteps grew louder between the library shelves, and David Miller gripped the edge of the desk. He whispered, "Someone is here." Laura Hayes stood slowly, her face pale in the dim light. Laura Hayes said, "No one should be inside." The echo came again, closer, accompanied by the scrape of books falling. David whispered, "We need to see who it is." Together they walked down the aisle, each step echoing unnaturally. At the end of the row, a figure darted out of sight, leaving a book open on the floor. Laura Hayes gasped. That was no ordinary intruder. David picked up the book and saw the same strange symbols etched inside. His heart pounded as he whispered, "It follows me everywhere." David Miller turned the pages, his breath catching as the symbols glowed faintly beneath the lamp. He whispered, "These marks are alive." Laura Hayes shook her head, whispering, "This book shouldn't even exist here." A sudden crash echoed from deeper inside, and both flinched. Laura Hayes said, "We need to leave before whoever is here returns." David clenched the book, muttering, "If I don't find answers now, I'll never escape this." His knuckles turned white against the pages as he tried to steady his hands. The shadows shifted again, forming shapes that almost resembled human figures. The tension broke as the front door slammed open, echoing through the library. A man in a dark jacket stepped into the light, his presence unsettling. Samuel Price said, "You shouldn't be here." David Miller froze, whispering, "Who are you?" Samuel Price smirked, replying, "Someone who knows more than you're ready to hear." Laura Hayes stepped forward, whispering, "This place is not safe for secrets." Samuel Price tilted his head, his eyes sharp as he said, "The charm was never meant to be found." David's stomach tightened, the words digging into his fear. David Miller stepped toward Samuel Price, anger rising to mask his fear. David Miller said, "You've been watching me, haven't you?" Samuel Price gave a faint smile, whispering, "You left the door open for eyes you never see." Laura Hayes said, "Enough riddles. What do you want with him?" Samuel Price stared at the metallic charm in David's hand, replying, "Return it before it consumes you." David shook his head fiercely, whispering, "I can't. It's already too late." The silence after his words pressed in, heavy and suffocating. The air inside the library shifted suddenly, the sound of whispering voices rising from nowhere. David Miller turned in panic, his grip on the charm trembling. Laura Hayes covered her ears, whispering, "They're here." Samuel Price stepped back slowly, whispering, "You've drawn them closer." David shouted, "What's coming?" The shelves rattled violently, books spilling across the floor as the whispers turned into shrieks. Samuel Price said, "You wanted truth. Now you'll have it." The lights flickered out, plunging the room into near darkness, leaving only the faint glow of the symbols to guide them. The library fell into silence after the whispers stopped, the glow of the metallic charm the only light in the room. David Miller whispered, "It's pulling them here." Laura Hayes pressed her palms to the desk, her voice shaking. "David, you have to let it go." Samuel Price smirked faintly, his eyes glinting in the dim glow. Samuel Price said, "She's right, but you already know why." David snapped, "You've been following me. What do you want?" Samuel Price stepped closer, replying, "To remind you that this isn't the first time you've held it." David froze, his breath shallow. Laura Hayes said, "What do you mean? He only just found it." Samuel Price whispered, "No, Laura. He had it once before. He forgot." David Miller shook his head violently, whispering, "You're lying. I've never seen this before." Samuel Price tilted his head, stepping further into the light. Samuel Price said, "Memories don't vanish. They're taken, and yours were stolen." Laura Hayes gasped softly, whispering, "Stolen by who?" Samuel Price's smile widened as he said, "By someone closer than you think." David felt his knees weaken as a chilling thought crossed his mind. He muttered, "This isn't possible." Samuel Price whispered, "You're in this because you chose to be once long ago." Laura Hayes reached for the book on the table, flipping pages quickly as her hands shook. Laura Hayes whispered, "These disappearances, they all connect to the same symbol." David Miller leaned closer, eyes scanning frantically. He whispered, "All these names, they vanished." Samuel Price said calmly, "And most never returned." Laura Hayes looked up, her voice low. "One of these dates matches your childhood." David's chest tightened as he muttered, "That's impossible." Samuel Price smiled faintly, whispering, "You were chosen before you understood what it meant." David Miller's breathing quickened as he pushed the book away. David Miller shouted, "No, I won't believe it." Laura Hayes stepped closer, whispering, "David, listen. If this is true, you're in deeper than you realized." Samuel Price chuckled, his tone sharp. Samuel Price said, "Denial won't protect you. The charm found its way back to you because it belongs to you." David's hand trembled as he stared at the charm. He muttered, "This thing is a curse." Samuel Price whispered, "It's more than a curse, it's a key." The words cut through the room, sinking deep into the silence. The walls seemed to pulse with unseen energy as the charm glowed brighter in David Miller's hand. Laura Hayes stepped back in fear, whispering, "It's alive." David whispered, "It's burning through me." Samuel Price raised his voice sharply, "Then you understand. The enemy isn't outside, it's within you." David froze, his mind spinning as the truth crashed into him. He whispered, "It was me all along." The room fell silent, except for the faint hum of the metallic charm, glowing stronger than ever. Samuel Price whispered, "Now you see why they'll never let you go." The silence in the library weighed heavier after Samuel Price's words, and David Miller felt as though the walls themselves pressed in closer. David Miller whispered, "You're twisting this. I was never part of it." Samuel Price leaned forward with calm menace. Samuel Price said, "Your denial doesn't erase the truth. You were chosen." Laura Hayes gripped David Miller's arm, whispering, "David, don't listen. He's trying to break you." Yet inside, doubt gnawed at David Miller's thoughts, every whisper from the past resurfacing like echoes of forgotten dreams. David Miller whispered, "Why can't I remember?" Samuel Price's cold smile deepened. Samuel Price said, "Because remembering would destroy you." David Miller pulled free from Laura Hayes's grasp and turned toward Samuel Price with trembling fury. David Miller said, "You've been watching me since the beginning, haven't you?" Samuel Price stepped back slowly, his voice sharp. Samuel Price said, "Not just watching, guiding." Laura Hayes' eyes widened in horror as she whispered, "You led him here?" Samuel Price smirked faintly, answering, "Someone had to. He wouldn't face the truth otherwise." David Miller's chest tightened with betrayal. He whispered, "So this was never random." The glow of the metallic charm pulsed, reflecting his inner turmoil. The tension broke when the library door creaked open again, revealing Officer Richard Hale stepping inside with heavy boots. Officer Richard Hale said, "What's going on here?" David Miller turned, relief flooding then vanishing when he noticed the officer's cold stare. David Miller said, "Richard, you need to help us." Officer Richard Hale shook his head slowly, his hand brushing against his holster. Officer Richard Hale said, "Help isn't what I came for." Laura Hayes whispered, "You too." Samuel Price chuckled softly, saying, "Finally, the broken authority arrives." David Miller's stomach twisted, realizing betrayal came from more than one place. David Miller's voice cracked as he shouted, "Richard, why are you here?" Officer Richard Hale stepped forward, his tone low. Officer Richard Hale said, "Because I've known about this longer than you." Laura Hayes gasped, whispering, "You were supposed to protect people." Officer Richard Hale's jaw tightened as he said, "Protection requires sacrifice." Samuel Price smirked, adding, "And sometimes sacrifice looks a lot like betrayal." David Miller gripped the metallic charm tighter, his voice shaking. David Miller said, "You all knew, and you left me blind." The silence after his words burned hotter than any scream. The library trembled with unseen energy as the truth weighed on them. David Miller whispered, "Everyone I trusted is tied to this." Laura Hayes placed her hand over her mouth, her voice trembling. Laura Hayes said, "David, we can still stop it." Officer Richard Hale's tone darkened as he said, "You can't stop what already began." Samuel Price leaned closer, whispering, "The closer you come to truth, the less you'll want it." The metallic charm pulsed violently, its glow spreading across David Miller's face as he muttered, "If this is what it wants, then I'll face it." The room vibrated as though alive. The library vibrated as if alive, shelves trembling under invisible pressure. David Miller gripped the metallic charm tightly, his voice cracking. David Miller said, "Tell me how to end this." Samuel Price stepped closer, his smirk gone. Samuel Price said, "You can't end it, only survive it." Laura Hayes whispered desperately, "David, don't trust him." Officer Richard Hale stood near the doorway, his voice dark. Officer Richard Hale said, "He's right. This force doesn't end, it consumes." David Miller's chest heaved as he whispered, "Then I'll fight it anyway." The glow of the charm flared violently, throwing eerie shadows across their faces. The whispers returned, louder, as if hundreds of unseen voices circled them. David Miller shouted, "Show yourself." Samuel Price raised his voice above the noise. Samuel Price said, "You invited them when you touched the charm." Laura Hayes covered her ears, crying out, "It's pulling them closer." Officer Richard Hale pulled his weapon, and aimed into the dark aisles, muttering, "Bullets won't stop what's already inside." The lights flickered violently, plunging the library into near blackness, the only light from the glowing charm in David Miller's trembling hand. A sudden gust of cold air surged through the library, scattering books across the floor. David Miller fell to one knee, the charm burning in his palm. David Miller whispered, "It wants to consume me." Samuel Price leaned forward, whispering, "Then let it, and you'll understand." Laura Hayes pulled him back sharply, shouting, "No, don't listen to him." Officer Richard Hale fired a shot into the shadows, the sound echoing violently, but the bullets seemed to vanish midair. The whispers turned to screams, chilling and hollow. David Miller cried out, "I won't give in." The glow from the charm expanded suddenly, casting the entire room in eerie blue light. David Miller stood again, his voice shaking but defiant. David Miller said, "You wanted me, now face me." Samuel Price's smirk returned faintly. Samuel Price said, "Careful what you wish for." Laura Hayes cried, "David, stop! You don't know what's inside." Officer Richard Hale stepped back cautiously, whispering, "It's too strong." The light swirled into shifting shapes, vague forms of figures with hollow eyes moving closer, their presence suffocating. The figures grew clearer, whispering in unison as their hollow eyes fixed on David Miller. He whispered, "You've been inside me all along." Samuel Price said, "Now you see the truth. You're both the hunter and the hunted." Laura Hayes cried, "David, resist them." Officer Richard Hale said grimly, "It's too late. Once it chooses, it never lets go." David Miller screamed, holding the charm tighter, the glow bursting into a blinding flare that shook the entire library. For a moment, everyone's faces froze in terror as the light swallowed them. The blinding light faded, leaving the library in eerie silence. David Miller gasped, his body trembling, the metallic charm smoldering in his hand. Laura Hayes whispered, "You're still here." Samuel Price's voice cut sharp. Samuel Price said, "But not unchanged." Officer Richard Hale stepped forward cautiously, his weapon lowered. Officer Richard Hale said, "The charm has marked him now." David Miller looked down at his hand where the symbols had burned faintly into his skin. David Miller whispered, "It's inside me." Laura Hayes' voice cracked as she whispered, "Then they'll never stop hunting you." The whispering figures had vanished, but the air still felt heavy. David Miller whispered, "They didn't leave. They're inside." Samuel Price leaned closer, whispering, "Now you understand. You are the doorway." Laura Hayes shook her head violently, crying out, "No, he's still himself." Officer Richard Hale's voice was steady, almost resigned. Officer Richard Hale said, "If he's the doorway, he can't remain here." David Miller looked between them, his voice hollow. David Miller whispered, "So I'm the enemy now." The silence that followed tightened like a noose around them all. David Miller backed toward the shattered window, the night air seeping inside. David Miller whispered, "If they're inside me, then I can't stay." Laura Hayes rushed forward, shouting, "Don't do this. We can fight it together." Samuel Price's smirk widened as he said, "Let him go. This was always his fate." Officer Richard Hale's eyes narrowed. Officer Richard Hale said, "If he leaves, the city suffers." David Miller's hand glowed brighter, the charm vibrating violently. David Miller whispered, "I don't have a choice." The glass cracked further beneath his weight. The wind howled through the broken window, scattering loose papers across the floor. David Miller turned one last time, his voice steady but filled with sorrow. David Miller said, "If I stay, you all die. If I go, maybe it ends." Laura Hayes cried out, "David, please don't leave me to this." Samuel Price's tone was cold as he said, "Sacrifice is the only way." Officer Richard Hale muttered, "This isn't sacrifice, it's exile." David Miller stepped onto the ledge, his glowing hand lighting his pale face. He whispered, "Goodbye." David Miller leapt from the ledge, vanishing into the night as the glow of the metallic charm streaked like a falling star. Laura Hayes collapsed to her knees, sobbing, whispering, he was the only one who could fight them. Samuel Price's voice echoed with quiet satisfaction. Samuel Price said, "Or the only one who could bring them here." Officer Richard Hale holstered his weapon, muttering, "This isn't over, not by a long shot." Outside, the night swallowed David Miller whole, the glow disappearing into darkness. Yet high above, a faint whisper lingered, "We are still watching."